Hello everyone, it's me, Giles with a J, the person who personally narrates this channel. Just remember, that will never change. We're on season 21 and the theme is strange and unusual, so if you have any suggestions that fit that theme, leave them in the comments. Otherwise, if you enjoy the show, slap that subscribe button, uppercut the like button, and turn on notifications. I post new episodes twice a week, a long episode every Monday and a shorter episode every Thursday. Now, on to the show. At 2:28 p.m. on August 28, 2003, a 46-year-old pizza delivery man named Brian Wells walked into a PNC bank in Erie, Pennsylvania. In his right hand was a cane, and under the collar of his shirt was a large bulge, indicating he was hiding something from view. After walking up to the teller that afternoon, he passed over a note which simply read, quote, "Gather employees with access codes to vault and work fast to fill bags with $250,000. You have only 15 minutes. Soon after that, it would become apparent just how serious the situation was when the bulge underneath Brian's shirt was revealed to be a bomb that had been strapped to his neck. Realizing what was going on, the teller did as they were asked and gave over as much money as they had access to. But while Brian would leave the bank without any further incident, it wouldn't be the end of the situation because just 15 minutes later, police officers arrived on the scene to find Brian sitting in a parking lot not far from the bank. There was no doubt that some people immediately thought it was a fake bomb in order to scare the bank employees into handing over money. But that doubt would be erased a couple of minutes later when the device detonated, killing Brian Wells. Now, that could have been the end of the story. It could have been assumed that Brian had created the bomb to use for a bank robbery and he accidentally killed himself. But when officers had first approached him, he had informed them that the bomb around his neck had been placed there against his will. That little piece of information was only the start of a truly bizarre story that would eventually lead to a twisted tale of greed, murder, and betrayal. This is Monsters. Brian Wells was born on November 15, 1956 in Warren, Pennsylvania, though he would move over to nearby Erie with his parents and 5 siblings at a young age. It was there he would often struggle as a teenager, with him often finding it difficult to do well in school. Because of that, as soon as he hit 16 years of age, he decided to drop out and go find work as a mechanic instead, as he felt that would be a better path for him in the long run. Not that he'd work as a mechanic for the rest of his life, however. No, by the time he reached his early 30s, he had left that job and had started working at Mamma Mia's pizzeria. That would be the job that would ultimately lead to his death. You know, the lucrative yet dangerous world of pizza delivery. It was on August 28, 2003 that the pizzeria received a call from a payphone asking for a delivery to be made to 8631 Peach Street, a location only a few miles away from the store. Brian grabbed the order and headed down the street to deliver the food, probably just hoping for a decent tip. As he would later try to explain to authorities in the moments before his death, that was where things took a turn for the worst. As he described it, upon arriving at the address, he was accosted by 3 black males who held him down and strapped a steel collar with 2 pipe bombs attached to it around his neck. The men then told Brian that if he did not follow their instructions to a T, the bomb would explode. What they wanted him to do next was go into a PNC bank branch and hand them over a note saying he wanted $250,000 in cash. Once that was done, he was to continue on with a scavenger hunt of sorts, following further instructions located at different places in order to have the collar removed. He began carrying out their orders, heading into the bank with a homemade shotgun given to him by his assailants. It was designed to look like a cane, just in case the need arose for him to shoot his way out. Thankfully, though, he would not have to open fire that afternoon. Once the teller realized how serious the situation was, they emptied all of the tills in the building. Unfortunately, that did not amount to the $250,000 Brian was looking for. Rather, it only added up to $8,702. Not an insignificant amount, but still a far cry from the amount he'd been told to take from the bank. Still, with there being nothing he could do about that, he chose to take the money and flee anyway, driving off and eventually arriving at a nearby parking lot. And that was where police found him around 15 minutes later, where they immediately pulled him out of the car and cuffed him as they figured out what to do next. But it wasn't just the police who were there by then. The local media had also arrived on the scene, looking for something they could put on the evening news. How surprised they were by the footage they'd end up getting because, as Brian was desperately trying to explain the situation to the authorities, the device around his neck suddenly started beeping, causing him to panic as he knew what was coming next. Around 10 seconds after that, the bomb exploded, killing Brian instantly and, at least initially, seemingly putting an end to the story. Of course, things were far from over. No, they were only just getting started. If nothing else, the media sensation the scene was about to cause would keep the case in the public eye for quite a while. After all, while the actual footage of the bomb exploding would not be shown on the news that evening, the footage of his final moments prior to that would. And that made the whole situation about as close to a snuff film as most people watching would have ever seen in their lives. But even then, the media furore would have likely died out pretty quickly were there not more intrigue involved. And after performing a search of Brian's body, the police found that the device strapped to his neck appeared to have been constructed in a DIY manner by someone who definitely knew what they were doing. Obviously, that suggested there was truth to the idea he'd been ambushed and forced into the situation, as it was unlikely someone with Brian's background would have been able to create such a device himself. And as if that wasn't enough evidence that there was a larger conspiracy going on, a search of the deceased's car revealed not only the shotgun disguised as a cane he'd taken into the bank, but also handwritten notes addressed to bomb hostage, which seemed to confirm he really was the victim in the situation. The notes were instructions for what Brian was supposed to do after the bank robbery. They told Brian to drive around town collecting a number of clues at various locations. That would be the only way he'd be able to ensure his freedom. As one of the notes read, quote, "There is only one way you can survive, and that is to cooperate completely. This powerful booby-trapped bomb can be removed only by following our instructions. Act now, think later, or you will die." Strangely, however, upon further inspection of the instructions within those notes, it became clear there was no way Brian would have survived even if he had followed them to the letter. That was because, given the amount of time it took for the bomb to go off, there was no way he would have been able to make it to all of the stops necessary. Clearly, whoever had forced him into the situation knew he wasn't going to get out of it alive, and it's possible he knew that too, which would explain why he looked so defeated when police caught up with him in that parking lot. Of course, as far as the authorities were concerned, no exploding neck collar was going to stop them from following that trail to its conclusion. So hoping to find more answers, that's exactly what they did, starting by looking at the first set of instructions on the notes found in Brian's car. That instruction told him to, quote, "Exit the bank with the money and go to the McDonald's restaurant. Get out of the car and go to the small sign reading drive-through, open 24 hours in the flower bed. By the sign there is a rock with a note taped to the bottom. It has your next instructions." Investigators would not need to head over to McDonald's though. For as much as he might have realized his fate was already sealed, Brian had at least gone to the effort of starting the scavenger hunt by retrieving that note, following those instructions, and collecting the second note which was found there. But that was ultimately where his journey had ended. So picking up where he left off, the investigators headed over to Peach Street next, the place they were told in that second note that they'd find additional instructions hidden in a flower bed. That note sent them to another location again, that time to a small road sign that was about 3 kilometers or a little less than 2 miles south of their location. It was there that they were supposed to find their next instruction hidden in a small jar in the woods nearby. But once they got there, the search hit a bit of a brick wall. Instead of getting the next step in the scavenger hunt, all investigators would find would be an empty jar, suggesting the person who had been in charge of the plan had figured out the authorities were looking into it and had decided to pull the plug on the whole endeavor before they got any further. That caused some frustration for the investigation team, but it was not the end of the line for them entirely. While there were no more clues to follow that might lead them directly to the perpetrators of the crime, they still had other ways of following up on what had happened. The primary detail they were able to follow up on at that point was Brian Wells himself, specifically his past and what may have led him to the situation he had found himself in. That's what led detectives to the Mamma Mia's pizzeria he'd been working at on the day of his death. Upon arrival, the investigation team questioned various other members of the staff about Brian. What did they know about him personally? Did he have any known enemies? And had there been any signs that something was wrong with him in the days and weeks leading up to the incident? That line of questioning bore no fruit as, according to his co-workers, Brian had led a pretty simple life, with none of them being aware of any trouble he had gotten himself into or any people he might have upset. Really, if anything, he was seen as being the kind of guy who, while quiet and insular, was well liked by everyone. That included his bosses, who felt they could always rely on him no matter what. As they would put it, during the 10 years that he had worked there, he'd only ever called in late once, and that was when his cat had died. So, with that not seeming to get the investigators anywhere, they moved on to asking about the delivery Brian had been sent out to make on the afternoon of his death. That was the one that he'd claimed he'd been accosted by 3 black males upon arriving at the location. As staff at Mamma Mia's pizzeria explained to detectives, the call for that order had come in around 1:30 p.m. And despite Brian's shift having already ended by that point, he agreed to make the delivery himself before heading home, with him leaving to do so around half an hour later. Of course, why Brian would agree to make that delivery even after his shift had ended was a question in itself, and one that would later become important in determining what had really happened on August 28th. But at the time, it was just put down to him being a good worker who was willing to help out his bosses, even when he didn't need to. It was certainly in fitting with the character that had been described to the investigators, so they didn't think much of that piece of information when they were first presented with it. No, they just kept listening as the staff informed them that the location Brian had been dispatched to was a TV transmission tower site in a wooded area just off Peach Street, the very same location where the scavenger hunt they'd tried to follow earlier had come to an abrupt end. Clearly, that was an important place to revisit. So investigators headed straight back over there, but much to their dismay, there was nobody there. That said, it wasn't like there were no clues there at all. Obviously, Brian had been on site previously as tire tracks and shoe prints consistent with him and the vehicle he had been driving were soon discovered. As to the involvement of any other people, though, particularly the 3 men Brian claimed had attacked him, well, there was simply nothing to show they'd ever been there at all. There was nothing to show they even existed, and at that point the investigation seemed to have hit another dead end. That might have been where things remained, as an unsolved crime were it not for the fact that, the following day, a reporter at the Erie Times-News received an anonymous tip about the TV transmission tower site being important in the case of Brian Wells. So at that point, he took it upon himself to head over there and have a look around, if for no other reason than because it might give him something he could get an article out of. After reaching the site with a photographer in tow, the reporter would spot what he described as a tall, heavy-set man walking around the area. That man would later be identified as Bill Rothstein. The reason he was walking around that area was because, in a fact that had somehow gone undiscovered by the authorities up until then, His home was located right next to the transmission tower. The obvious next question then was, how was Bill involved in the bank robbery and murder, if at all? It certainly seemed reasonable to assume that the pizza delivery had been meant for him, given how close his home was to the spot Brian had been sent to. But even if that was true, it wouldn't explain the presence of the 3 black men who were alleged to have been involved. Also, simply seeing Bill in the area wasn't proof of him being part of the situation. At best, it was circumstantial evidence. Perhaps that's why the reporter chose not to pass the information on to the authorities at the time. But it wouldn't be long before Bill fell under the purview of investigators anyway. That's because, less than 1 month later on September 20th, he was brought right into the center of the story after he called 911 and gave a chilling confession that there was a dead body stored in his freezer. Needless to say, it didn't take long for the authorities to arrive at his door, and when they confirmed that there was indeed the body of a, at that point unidentified male in his freezer, they arrested Bill on the spot. The following questions were very clear. Who did the body belong to, and what led to it being put on ice on Bill's property? Once at the station, Bill opened up about the events leading up to his call to 911. He explained that in mid-August he'd received an out-of-the-blue phone call from an ex-girlfriend named Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong. She told him over the phone she had recently found herself in a very bad situation and she needed his help right away. Now, Marjorie was someone who was no stranger to getting into trouble before that. All throughout her life, she'd been surrounded by conflict and turbulence. A big part of the reason for that was because, as a young woman, she was diagnosed with pretty severe cases of narcissistic personality disorder and bipolar disorder, something that led her to being very good at manipulating others into doing what she wanted. She would become very angry and violent if those people didn't comply. When she had first come into contact with Bill Rothstein some years before that, it hadn't taken him long to be drawn into her web, and that feeling of loyalty to her would continue even after their breakup. So when she called him up looking for help, he agreed to do whatever she needed. Of course, once he learned what level of trouble Marjorie was in, though, he was taken aback to say the least. As he put it, according to her, she'd gotten into an argument over money with her partner at the time, someone named Jim Roden, and over the course of that argument, she'd shot and killed him. So what she wanted was for Bill to go over to her house and help her not only clean up the crime scene, but also get rid of the body. At that point, most people would have probably chosen to step away from the situation and call the police. But as has already been stated, Bill was a man who still had a lot of feelings for Marjorie, for better or worse. Some believed he was still outright in love with her. And that would explain why, against all of his better judgment, he chose to head over to her home and begin the process of helping her clean up as she had requested. After making the 9-mile or 15-kilometer journey, Bill not only got rid of the murder weapon, but also helped mop up any blood and clean any surfaces in the property. Then once that was done, he took the body of Jim Roden and stored it in the freezer of his garage. And that would be where the body would remain for the next 5 weeks, sitting on ice as Bill waged an internal war with himself over whether or not what he was doing was right. At one point, he became so torn up by his involvement that he considered suicide. He went as far as to write a note that expressed his apologies to those who knew him. In the end, though, he wouldn't take life, and he would maintain enough strength to refuse when Marjorie asked him to grind up the body so there was no way it could ever be identified in the future. No, that was a step too far for Bill. After all, to help hide a body was one thing, but to dispose of it in such a way, well, that was just an unnecessary level to go to as far as he was concerned. Even his fears that Marjorie may do something bad to him should he not cooperate were not enough to force him to follow through with that request. Here's a clip from that interview.
Yeah. She holds it against him because does she feel that they're responsible for her theft?
Well, she feels that they're responsible for her theft, and since Jim introduced them, he is also responsible for their theft. Although that may not have been the thing that caused his demise, that is a great factor in it.
Did she ever indicate the amount taken during the theft?
Yes.
What was the amount?
Somewhere around $133,000 or $136,000.
Explain that to them.
Okay. There was a court, there was a suit against St. Vincent, I believe, and her husband, her past husband, had died at the hospital, and supposedly there was a gag order, so she wouldn't tell me what there was for money, and she got money and she didn't have to pay any taxes on it. So legally this money was hers, and she kept it in a purse. She slept on that purse. So supposedly these guys got that amount of money, which was like somewhere around $133,000, $136,000.
So now we know why she blames Jim Roden because of these people that she suspects of stealing her money.
Jim Roden sort of like laughed. I guess Jim Roden was a relative, according to what she said, was a relatively, had very little money. He was like a daddy that doesn't pay his bills and took off, and there was court stuff out for him from out, I think, of Ohio. And anyway, so what he did was, I guess, maybe this is the thing that sort of pushed her over, but it wasn't the end of the thing. He laughed because she had lost her money, and maybe she thought that it was because he didn't have any, and she lost hers, that maybe it made an equal or something like that. I don't know, that's supposition. But anyway, I think that was another factor that pushed her into murdering him.
Bill told a long and complicated story about how Marjorie had been robbed and the people who robbed her had been introduced to her by Jim, and that was part of the reason she had shot him. Either way, it was clear that Marjorie had murdered Jim, and it wouldn't take the investigators long to track her down. In fact, it would be on September 21st, just a month after Bill had come forward, that she was finally caught. And after being arrested for the murder of Jim Roden, she came to realize there was no talking her way out of it. So in January of 2005, she pleaded guilty to the murder and was sentenced to 20 years behind bars. Bill wouldn't end up serving any time for his involvement in the cover-up, but that was because he was dead by then. In July of 2004, he passed away after a short battle with lymphoma. But even with him dead and Marjorie behind bars, the story wasn't over. There was still no connection between either of them and Brian Wells, but by then, investigators were confident that Bill and Marjorie had something to do with it. Not just because Bill's house was close to the pizza delivery address, but also because of the last line Bill had written in his side note back when he was considering taking his own life. At the end of the note, when describing the murder and subsequent storage of Jim Roden, he had written, quote, "This has nothing to do with the Brian case." Obviously, that sentence piqued the interest of detectives working on the case of Brian Wells. After all, it wasn't like there was any specific connection to be drawn between the death of Jim Roden and the death of Brian Wells at the time, but people most certainly started drawing those connections once they read that line. Still though, there being no information to directly link the two other than circumstantial details about Brian being asked to deliver a pizza to a location close to Bill Rothstein's house prior to his murder, there was no way investigators could really follow up on any potential link. Bill certainly wasn't going to say anything else about it before he died, and once he was gone, that fact would be permanent. As for Marjorie, well, she was keeping her mouth shut on any connection she had to Brian as well. It really felt like, after having a brief moment of promise, the case really had hit its final dead end. But then something else happened in April of 2005, only 3 months after Marjorie had been sentenced to 20 years in prison. The investigation team that was being led by Jerry Clark of the FBI and Jason Wick of the ATF received a phone call that blew the whole case wide open once more. Basically what happened was, while questioning Marjorie about an unrelated homicide while she was locked up at the Muncie State Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania, a police officer had been able to get her to confess that Jim Roden's murder actually was connected to that of Brian Wells. And what's more, she was willing to spill the beans about the whole thing in exchange for being moved to a minimum security prison in nearby Cambridge Springs. All that had to be done first was to get Marjorie moved over to the new prison. When she was finally there, she told them a tale so crazy any fears she might have been lying to them seemed ridiculous, as it felt like it was impossible anyone could have made it up. It all started when her ex-boyfriend Bill Rothstein got back in touch with her in 2003. He reintegrated himself into her life and eventually formulated a plan that would see them both have enough money to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. You see, Marjorie's father was a man who had a lot of money. At one point, his estate was valued at around $1.8 million. After his daughter had gotten herself into trouble with the law during her younger years, he made the decision to cut off any financial support to her going forward. But while that might seem like a cold thing for a father to do, it makes a lot more sense when you take into account the fact that the trouble Marjorie had gotten herself into involved her being charged with the murder of an ex-boyfriend named Robert Thomas. That's right, back in 1984 when the pair were together, while having an argument, Marjorie had shot him 6 times, killing him. Sound familiar? Ultimately, though, she had gotten off of a murder charge on grounds of self-defense, with her claiming she only fired the gun as she was fearful for her own safety. While that was a plausible defense at the time, it became harder to believe in hindsight when, just 4 years later, her then-husband Richard Armstrong also died under mysterious circumstances. He had died of a head injury that led to a cerebral hemorrhage while he was in the hospital. Marjorie was not arrested in relation to Richard's death. When that incident happened, it was initially ruled as non-suspicious, mostly because the fact the victim had a head injury when he arrived at the hospital was never made clear to the coroner's office while they were carrying out the autopsy. And while none of that means Marjorie killed her husband, it definitely raised suspicions, especially as it was clear she was capable of taking a life before that, or just losing control of herself and acting in a violent manner. It was certainly enough of a possibility that her father felt the need to cut her off. Unsurprisingly, that made Marjorie very upset. So upon reconnecting with Bill, she was only too happy to go along with the plan when he suggested hiring someone to kill her father. That way, she'd be able to collect the money she felt she was owed via his will. And once that happened, she and Bill would be able to live a happy life together. Before they could hire a hitman to take out her father, though, they needed the money to pay that hitman. That was where the plan hit its first snag, as neither of them had that kind of cash on hand. That was when Bill came up with the idea of robbing a bank in order to get the funds quickly. Or at least Marjorie claimed it was Bill who came up with all of it on his own, a convenient fact for her to sprinkle in given he was dead and could no longer defend himself. But that wasn't the part of the confession that interested the team who'd been investigating the murder of Brian Wells the most. No, the part that tied the whole thing into their case directly was when they were told that the bank robbery Bill had allegedly masterminded had been the one which had led to the collar bomb murder. And what's more, as far as she claimed at least, Brian had been a willing party and co-conspirator in the plan. Obviously, it didn't take long for the investigators to go talk to Marjorie themselves. And when they did, they learned exactly how the whole plan had gone down, or at least what her version of the situation was. The way she described it, after the initial plan to rob the bank in order to pay for a hitman had been formulated, the pair had gotten into contact with Brian through a sex worker they knew who he liked to frequent. Her name was Jessica Hoopstick. It was her who explained to Marjorie and Bill that Brian was someone who was in a lot of financial trouble, specifically over debts he owed to a local drug dealer. She seemed confident that they would be able to convince Brian to take part in the plot. All in exchange for a nice payday, of course. Following that, the plan was put into motion, with the device being constructed and Brian being told that, should he be caught by the authorities, to claim it had been fitted around his neck forcibly by 3 black males. As to why the bomb had exploded and killed him before he could get it off, well, that was something Marjorie would not go into detail about. And that wasn't the only thing that gave the investigators pause when considering how much of the truth she was actually telling. There was also the fact that 4 separate informants had come forward at around the same time to say that the entire plot had indeed been her brainchild, not Bill's. They also said that the reason Jim Roden had actually been shot by her was because he was threatening to expose the plan. But even if that was damning, it was not enough to formally charge Marjorie quite yet. No, for the time being, police had no choice but to keep looking into the case in search of that one smoking gun. Then, a few months later, yet another witness came forward to tell what they knew about the murder of Brian Wells. He claimed there was a fourth as of yet unknown party involved in the crime. According to the informant, he was the brother-in-law of a man named Kenneth Barnes. Kenneth, as it turned out, was an old fishing buddy of Marjorie's, and one night while he and his brother-in-law were talking, he spilled a lot of information about what had really gone on with Brian, including the depth to which he was part of everything. Once agents Jerry Clark and Jason Wick learned that, they went to visit Kenneth. By then, he was in the middle of a separate sentence on unrelated drug charges. Once they sat down to talk to him, he was immediately eager to tell all he knew, in exchange for a lighter punishment, of course. In the end, the story he was telling seemed a lot more credible than Marjorie's. That was why they made him a deal to cut his prison time in half if he gave all the information he had to detectives. He agreed and explained that, while things had largely gone as Marjorie had claimed, she left out some key parts. Not only had she lied when she claimed she wasn't the ringleader, but she neglected to mention that he was also part of those discussions, as he was the one who'd been hired to kill her father in exchange for $250,000. Perhaps most crucial, though, Kenneth told the investigators that he'd be willing to testify against Marjorie in a court of law if it meant bringing her down. And with him being someone who, at least as far as he claimed, was right there when the conspiracy was being hatched and was even throwing in ideas himself, that finally gave investigators all the ammunition they needed to formally charge Marjorie on counts of armed bank robbery, conspiracy, and using a destructive device in a crime of violence in July of 2007. Even when that happened, though, and an additional conviction seemed assured, Marjorie would still not accept defeat. Rather, she tried to worm her way out of the situation once again by telling more information to the investigators in an effort to make her own deal. The only problem with that, however, was that she forgot to actually get a deal done in writing before she started spilling her secrets. So once she was done, she had only managed to dig an even deeper hole for herself. She had basically admitted that, despite what she had told detectives before, she was indeed one of the people who masterminded the entire bank robbery plot. In fact, she, Bill, and Kenneth had all played an equal role as she was then claiming. Realistically then, there was nothing that was going to save her from being prosecuted. Even when she tried to get off on grounds of being mentally incompetent, it would do no good, as on September 9th, 2009, after being evaluated at a mental health facility, the presiding judge would find her competent to stand trial. The trial started in 2010 and was quite the circus. Based on testimony given from Kenneth, the whole plot had been a creation of Marjorie's, with Bill only going along with it out of some combination of fear and love he had for his ex-partner, and Kenneth only getting involved because he wanted to get paid for the job he was being asked to do. As for Brian Wells, well, while he had initially been on board, largely because he did indeed have a lot of debts to pay off and was in need of money fast, the only reason he was so happy to get involved was because he was originally told the bomb around his neck would be fake. And not only that, but that the scavenger hunt he would be asked to follow once the robbery was over would merely be a diversion designed to throw the police off the scent, something he could use to claim plausible deniability over his involvement after the fact. As time had gone on, however, things had changed and Brian had gone from being a willing participant to an unwilling pawn in the crime, with the turning point happening when Marjorie had double-crossed him on the day of the robbery and fitted a real bomb around his neck instead of a fake one. According to the prosecution, she had decided late in the game that having another person who knew the truth and who could talk to the authorities was a bad idea, so it was better to just get rid of him altogether. It was true that there was never any way Brian was going to get that bomb off of his neck before it exploded. Rather, once it was strapped on him, his days were numbered. And he probably knew that to some degree, which would explain his later desperate conversation with police in the moments before he died. Even if he had been able to make it to that second or third stop on the scavenger hunt before the detonation occurred, the idea he could ever get to the fourth, fifth, and beyond before time ran out was just something that was never going to be a reality. Of course, as you would expect, once Marjorie took the stand herself, she strongly denied that any of that was true. No, as she would state, she never even met Brian before. In fact, the first time she'd heard his name was when it had shown up on the news. Prior to that, she'd been blissfully ignorant of the details surrounding his involvement. Sure, that contradicted much of what she had already told detectives on record, but she either didn't seem to realize that or didn't seem to care. That ultimately did little to sway the jury in her favor. Even the Hail Mary play of letting the court know she had just been diagnosed with terminal glandular cancer did nothing to get them on her side. It also didn't sway the judge to call for an end to the trial on compassionate grounds, as she had only been given 3 to 7 years to live. To him, it didn't matter if Marjorie's time left on Earth was limited. She was still going to have to pay the consequences for her actions. After the lead prosecutor gave a convincing closing statement that painted the defendant as a truly evil sociopath who was all too aware of what she had been doing at each step along the journey, and who had killed 2 people in cold blood in order to keep her involvement a secret, the jury was sent away for a short deliberation. Nobody was surprised when, on November 1st, 2010, they found Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong guilty on all 3 counts. She was sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 30 years. Obviously, given she only had a few years left to live, that meant there was no hope she was ever going to see freedom again. But she wasn't the only person involved in the conspiracy who was due to be punished. While Bill Rothstein and Brian Wells were both dead and couldn't be convicted of any crimes themselves, Kenneth was very much alive. That said, because of his cooperation with the police in bringing Marjorie to justice, his initial 45-year sentence was reduced to 22.5 years by the time all was said and done. So that closed the official case of the pizza bomber. But even today it's still not fully closed for many amateur sleuths, as there's still a lot of unanswered questions as to what exactly happened during the lead-up to the bank robbery, specifically in relation to just how involved and willing Brian really was. While the general consensus remains that Brian was at least initially on board and was very much a co-conspirator, with him only changing his stance when he was screwed over at the last second, an interview carried out in 2018 with Jessica Hoopstick, the sex worker who had initially introduced Brian to the rest of the crew, seems to argue against that. As she put it when speaking to Time magazine, the pizza delivery man had no advance knowledge of the plan to rob the bank at all and had only been forced to get involved at the very last second after he arrived on the scene with the pizza in hand. Basically, the insinuation from Jessica was that Brian was nothing more than a patsy who was taken advantage of, so to cast him in the same light as Marjorie, Bill, and Kenneth was doing an injustice to his memory. Of course, given she isn't the most credible source though, many aren't so quick to believe Jessica's claims. My question to that claim is, why Brian would tell the police that 3 black men had forced the collar onto him instead of telling the authorities about Marjorie, Bill, and Kenneth. It's also suspicious that he seemed eager to deliver the pizza after his shift was over. Sure, his employer said he was a helpful guy, but if they weren't short-staffed, it seemed like he wanted to make that delivery for some other reason. Obviously, the question of how involved Brian was remains an open one to this day. But that's not the only question about the pizza bomber case which remains unanswered. There's another possible additional element to the case that retired FBI investigator Jim Fisher has attempted to get to the bottom of in the years since. For him, it all started when he was reviewing the news footage of Brian that had been filmed in the moments leading up to his death. Based on what took place that afternoon, there was no way Marjorie could have been the one responsible for planning the robbery and subsequent murder. As proof of that, he would point to the profile of the bomber produced by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. As that profile stated, quote, "It continues to be the opinion of the department that this is much more than a mere bank robbery. The behavior seen in this crime was choreographed by a caller bomber watching on the sidelines according to a written script in which he attempted to direct others to do what he wanted them to do. Because of the complex nature of this crime, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit believes there were multiple motives for this offender, and money was not the primary one. All of that is to say that Jim Fisher believes whoever was behind the heist had motives that went far beyond getting some cash quickly. As far as he's concerned, there was at least one other primary reason behind what they were doing, and given what is known about Marjorie, that would seemingly rule her out as being the mastermind. After all, if it was all about the money as she was supposedly seeking, then it would make no sense for the bomb to be set to blow long before Brian could ever realistically make it somewhere that he could hand that money over. It's important to remember that any money that was stolen during the robbery of the PNC Bank on August 28, 2003 never actually reached any of the conspirators. That would seemingly make the entire plan a pointless endeavor. So with that being ruled out as the primary motive in the eyes of Jim Fisher, he would go on to present the alternative theory that it had all been done in order to create a puzzle so intricate and complex it would keep people guessing forever as an unsolvable mystery of sorts. As to who might be responsible for such a plot, well, Jim felt that Bill was the most likely culprit. That would potentially explain why he was the one to contact authorities in order to inform them about his ex-partner's involvement in Jim Roden's death. That way, he would get the opportunity to frame things the way he wanted to before anyone else involved in the caper got a chance to tell their side of the story. That said, as enticing as that theory may sound, it is still just a theory because nothing Jim Fisher has put forward has ever been proven. It's quite possible that Brian was going to be instructed to leave the money at one of the stops on the scavenger hunt, but the instructions were changed after the authorities got involved. It's also possible that the FBI profile is wrong. FBI profiles have a good record when it comes to identifying the traits of killers, but they're far from infallible. The theory also doesn't add up when you take into account how much of the crime Marjorie ended up confessing to. Officially, the real mastermind behind the pizza bomber murder was Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong, with Bill Rothstein, Kenneth Barnes, and to some degree Brian Wells all being mere co-conspirators. The crime was just about getting the money she needed in order to pay for her father's assassination. And when it comes to that, my biggest question about the case is, why set up an elaborate plot to rob a bank, including killing someone, in order to pay a hitman to kill her father? Why not just kill her father? Surely it would have been easier to kill him and make it look like an accident than to carry out the convoluted plan they had come up with. Of course, if that is the truth, then the families of those who were affected by her can hopefully find some peace in the fact that, with Marjorie dying in prison on April 4th, 2017, she'll never be able to hurt anyone else again. But while she is gone now, she certainly hasn't gone lost to time, as the pizza bomber case has found itself being covered in multiple different outlets over the years. Aside from being the subject of the book Pizza Bomber, The Untold Story of America's Most Shocking Bank Robbery, and being looked at in Mania and Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong, Inside the Mind of a Female Serial Killer, as well as receiving the Netflix true crime treatment in their series Evil Genius, the true story of America's most diabolical bank heist. There was also a movie made with a very similar plot called 30 Minutes or Less, but the cast and crew claimed that it was not about this case. Sony Pictures released a statement saying, quote, "Neither the filmmakers nor the stars of 30 Minutes or Less were aware of the crime prior to their involvement in the film." Not everyone believes that, but that's what they claim. And that means this tragic tale will continue to live on for some time to come, something which actually gives Marjorie what she wanted in many ways: eternal life. After all, this was a woman whose narcissistic traits frequently saw her view herself as being better than most people around her, and worthy of being held up on a pedestal for all time. As she once said when describing her own mind and the mental illness which inhabited it, quote, "You have to remember, and I am not just bragging about it, but it has been linked to genius. Lincoln, Churchill, Teddy Roosevelt, Van Gogh, Beethoven, Hemingway, some of the greatest artists and writers who ever lived were bipolar. But unlike those people whose minds are remembered for greatness, Marjorie did something which will not label her an artist or a writer, but a monster. Thanks so much for letting me tell you this story. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave a comment. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.